Recent reports indicate a significant surge in protests across China, a country where public dissent is traditionally suppressed by the government. These protests have been sparked by various grievances, including economic issues, human rights concerns, and dissatisfaction with government policies. The increasing frequency and intensity of these demonstrations reflect growing discontent among different segments of the population, from workers and students to middle-class citizens.
Firstly, thank you for watching, and don't forget to smash that like, subscribe, and notification bell for more global finance uncovered, as we continue to work hard and around the clock to always deliver and improve on our content for you. We would greatly appreciate your additional support by you clicking the like button, notification bell, and subscribe button and joining our channel's growth.
Despite the government's efforts to maintain social stability, these protests are becoming harder to control, posing a significant challenge to the ruling Communist Party. One of the primary drivers behind the recent wave of protests is economic frustration. China's economy, once the envy of the world, has faced numerous challenges in recent years, including slowing growth, rising unemployment, and an ongoing real estate crisis. Many citizens feel the economic slowdown is disproportionately affecting them, particularly younger generations who struggle with job insecurity and a lack of affordable housing. This economic discontent has led to widespread demonstrations, with protesters demanding better wages, job opportunities, and more government support. Additionally, there has been a noticeable rise in protests related to human rights and political freedoms. The Chinese government's strict control over freedom of expression, assembly, and press has long been a point of contention, but recent crackdowns have ignited even greater anger among the populace. High-profile cases, such as the imprisonment of activists and journalists, have mobilized citizens who are increasingly willing to take to the streets to demand their rights. This has been particularly evident in regions like Hong Kong, where protests against Beijing's influence have continued despite severe crackdowns. Labor unrest is another significant factor contributing to the rise in protests. Workers across various industries, including manufacturing, transportation, and education, have staged strikes and demonstrations to protest against low wages, poor working conditions, and unfair treatment. The government's failure to address these concerns has only fueled further anger, leading to more organized and larger-scale protests. In some cases, these labor protests have turned violent, resulting in clashes with police and security forces. Environmental issues have also become a flashpoint for protests in China. As the government continues to prioritize economic development, environmental degradation has become a growing concern for many citizens. Protests have erupted in response to pollution, deforestation, and industrial projects that threaten local ecosystems and public health. These environmental protests are often led by grassroots organizations and local communities who feel their voices are ignored by the authorities. The Chinese government's response to these protests has been predictable but increasingly ineffective. Authorities have relied on a combination of censorship, propaganda, and force to quell dissent, but these measures have done little to address the underlying causes of the unrest. Instead, they have often exacerbated tensions, leading to more determined and widespread protests. The government's inability to silence dissent entirely suggests that the social contract between the ruling party and the population is fraying. One particularly worrying aspect of the recent protests is the government's increased reliance on surveillance and technology to monitor and suppress dissent. China has developed one of the most sophisticated surveillance systems in the world, using facial recognition, internet monitoring, and artificial intelligence to track and control its citizens. However, this has not deterred protesters, who have become more adept at organizing and communicating under the radar. The ongoing cat-and-mouse game between protesters and the state highlights the growing disconnect between the government and the people. International observers are also paying close attention to the rise in protests in China. The increasing unrest has implications not just for China's domestic stability but also for global politics and economics. As protests grow in scale and intensity, there are concerns about how the Chinese government might respond, both internally and externally. Some analysts fear that Beijing could resort to more drastic measures, including martial law or increased repression, which could have significant consequences for regional stability and international relations. The rise in protests also reflects a broader generational divide in China. Younger generations, who have grown up in an increasingly connected and globalized world, are more likely to question authority and demand greater freedoms. They are less willing to accept the status quo and are more inclined to express their discontent publicly. This generational shift poses a significant challenge to the ruling party, which has traditionally relied on a combination of economic growth and nationalism to maintain its legitimacy. As the protests continue to increase in number and intensity, the Chinese government faces a critical test. How it responds to this growing wave of dissent will have profound implications for the future of the country. If the government fails to address the root causes of the unrest, it risks further alienating its population and destabilizing the nation. On the other hand, if it chooses to engage with the protesters' demands, it could open the door to significant political and social reforms that could reshape China for years to come.
The escalation of protests in China is not just confined to major urban centers like Beijing and Shanghai, but has also spread to smaller cities and rural areas, where grievances often go unnoticed by the broader public. In these regions, citizens have become increasingly vocal about issues such as land seizures, corruption, and inadequate public services. Rural residents, who traditionally had limited means to express their discontent, are now organizing protests with the help of social media and other digital platforms. This growing unrest in less visible parts of the country adds another layer of complexity to the government's efforts to maintain control. A significant driver of the protests is the mounting frustration over the government's handling of COVID-19 and its aftermath. China's strict zero-COVID policy, which included harsh lockdowns and extensive surveillance, has left a lasting impact on the population. The economic toll of these measures, coupled with the social isolation and mental health challenges they created, has fueled widespread anger. Protests against the government's pandemic response have continued even as restrictions have eased, with many citizens demanding accountability for the economic and personal hardships they endured. The role of technology in these protests cannot be overstated. While the Chinese government has employed advanced surveillance techniques to monitor and suppress dissent, protesters have also adapted, using encrypted messaging apps, VPNs, and other digital tools to organize and share information. This digital battleground has become a critical aspect of the protest, with both sides constantly evolving their strategies. The use of technology by protesters underscores a growing sophistication in how dissent is organized and expressed, making it more challenging for authorities to contain. Ethnic and regional tensions have also contributed to the rise in protests. In regions like Xinjiang and Tibet, where minority groups have long been subject to harsh government policies, protests have taken on an additional layer of intensity. The suppression of cultural and religious freedoms in these areas has led to widespread resentment, with some protests turning violent. The Chinese government's heavy-handed approach to these regions has only deepened the divide, leading to more frequent and severe unrest. This highlights the broader challenges China faces in managing its diverse population and maintaining national unity. The Chinese government's use of the legal system to crack down on dissent has also come under scrutiny. New laws and regulations have been introduced that further restrict freedom of speech, assembly, and the press. These measures have been met with resistance from various segments of society, including lawyers, journalists, and academics, who see them as an assault on civil liberties. Protests against these legal restrictions have been widespread, with demonstrators calling for greater transparency in the protection of basic rights. The legal crackdown has thus become another flashpoint in the broader wave of unrest. Education has emerged as a surprising catalyst for some of the recent protests. University students, traditionally seen as a key pillar of future stability, have increasingly taken to the streets to voice their concerns about academic freedom, job prospects, and political repression. The Chinese government's attempts to control university curricula and suppress campus activism have only fueled further discontent among students. These protests, often led by a younger and more politically aware generation, reflect a growing challenge to the government's control over educational institutions and the shaping of public opinion. The global economic downturn and China's own economic challenges have also played a significant role in the protests. As economic growth slows and inequality rises, more people are taking to the streets to demand economic justice. The government's failure to address issues such as income inequality, unemployment, and the rising cost of living has sparked widespread frustration. These economic protests are not just about immediate financial concerns but also reflect deeper anxieties about the future and the government's ability to provide stability and prosperity. The influence of external factors on the protests cannot be ignored. Global movements for democracy, human rights, and environmental protection have resonated with many Chinese citizens who see parallels between their own struggles and those of people in other countries. International support for Chinese protesters, particularly from the diaspora and human rights organizations, have provided a moral boost to the movement. However, this external support has also drawn the ire of the Chinese government, which often portrays protests as being influenced by foreign forces to delegitimize them. The Chinese government's response to the growing unrest has included both repression and attempts at reform, while the authorities continue to use force, censorship, and legal measures to suppress protests. There have also been some efforts to address the underlying causes. For example, in response to labor unrest, there have been limited moves to improve working conditions and wages in certain sectors. Similarly, environmental protests have led to the suspension or reevaluation of some controversial projects. However, these reforms are often seen as too little, too late, and have not been enough to quell the broader discontent. Looking ahead, the future of protests in China remains uncertain. The government's ability to maintain control will likely depend on its willingness to address the root causes of the unrest, including economic inequality, political repression, and social grievances. If the authorities continue to rely solely on repression, the protests may become even more widespread and intense, potentially leading to a cycle of violence and instability. On the other hand, meaningful reforms could help ease tensions and restore some level of social harmony. However, given the entrenched nature of the issues at hand, any resolution is likely to be complex and fraught with challenges.
Thank you for watching, and don't forget to smash that subscribe, like, and notification bell for more global finance uncovered.